we will have a conversation about entrepreneurship and catching up on what has happened in the previous session and adding a couple of things. So, Hannes, please get started.
Well, I would start by thanking everybody for attending here. It's a pleasure to be here. But what I'm going to do is very briefly to discuss three enemies of entrepreneurship, or three people who haven't really understood entrepreneurship adequately: Karl Marx, John Rawls, and Thomas Piketty, and what is wrong with their approach. If you look at Karl Marx, then he simplified greatly society. He divided people up into the owners of labor and the owners of capital, whereas basically what we have is people who sell knowledge and people who innovate. There is no space in Marx's theory for venture capitalists and entrepreneurs. He conceived of the whole of society as one big factory owned by the capitalists and used or utilized by the workers. Totally wrong. What really makes the world go around is innovation and entrepreneurship. And the people who are crucial for the creative power of capitalism are the venture capitalists and the innovators and the entrepreneurs. And we perhaps see this best if we try to look at two ways of innovation. One is to establish a government fund with, say, 10 board members and let them choose who should get the funds that are set aside by society for innovation and entrepreneurship. The other one is to have a wide dispersal of resources and assets amongst, let's say, 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million rather well-off people who then decide how to invest. Now let us say that they are 100,000. I would argue that if we have this one government fund, we would have 10, 20, 30, perhaps 100 experiments. But if we have 100,000 entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, we are at least going to have 100,000 experiments. So the experimental, innovative process is so much more lively when we have the dispersal of assets amongst the capitalists. They play a crucial role, venture capitalists and others as people. And this is a great era of Karl Marx. If we then move on to John Rawls, who was very fashionable amongst left-wingers, say 30 or 40 years ago, John Rawls actually came up with a very interesting approach to justice, which was that the society is just where the worst off are as well off as they could be. And Friedrich von Hayek, my intellectual mentor, he said that this was relevant, for example, for your choice of the country in which you wanted your children to live and be brought up in. And what I would like to argue is that capitalism survives Rawls' test with flying colors. Because if we look at the Index of Economic Freedom, published annually by the Fraser Institute in Vancouver and many other institutes around the world, what we see is if we divide the countries of the world, the economies of the world into the four quartiles, then the average income of the poorest 10% in the unfreest quartile is actually lower than, well, what I wanted to say was that the average income of the poorest 10% and the richest quartile is actually higher than the average income of everybody in the lowest quartile, which is really amazing. The poorest people in the rich countries are richer than everybody on average in the unfree economies of the world. So it's absolutely clear, if we look at the evidence, that the worst off are best off in countries that are free economies. And then we turn to Thomas Piketty, who has now become the most fashionable left-wing guru. There is one great difference between Thomas Piketty and John Rawls, and it is that John Rawls, after all, was concerned with the poor. He looked upon poverty as a social problem, but Thomas Piketty looks upon it a problem that people are rich, that they're entrepreneurs, that they are capitalists, that they accumulate money. And there is one factor which is very interesting, and it is that the composition of the rich has greatly changed in the last 30 or 40 years. Sunday Times every year publishes a list of the richest people in the United Kingdom, and Forbes publishes every year a list of the billionaires in the world. And what has happened that 30 or 40 years ago, 2/3 of the richest in the United Kingdom, they were people who had inherited. Now 1/3 is of that ilk. 2/3 now are people who have created their wealth. So my argument would be that Piketty's worries about the rich are totally unfounded. He actually quotes Balzac's novels like Old Goriot in support of his arguments. But if you read that novel as I've done, then you see actually how precarious wealth is, how fragile it is, how difficult it is to maintain wealth over generations. It is not glued to people like Piketty thinks. My argument is really, therefore, that what we have to do is to applaud the venture capitalists and the entrepreneurs and the innovators and the creators of wealth, and that we have to support a society which is built on 3 pillars: private property, free trade, and limited government.
Well, thank you, Hannes. You popped up upon a couple of things that were truly interesting. And when you say capitalism, so I always explain to my students the precondition for capitalism is property rights and the severe defense of property rights. And when we look back at the Austrian School of Economics, there are 2 authors that come to my mind. One of them was, of course, Hayek, and when he also provided the idea of what we need as a free society, as free individuals, and as for free enterprises to become prosperous, and especially at the Constitution for Liberty, and in many other of his essays he wrote about that. And also creative destruction from Schumpeter, which is truly important for entrepreneurship and for innovation and for creativity. And so what would be from your side, Dan, what would be your kind of frameworks, let's say, like taxes, no regulation or limited regulation, etc., that you would add to have a prosperous entrepreneurial society? And also, do you think everybody can be an entrepreneur?
Well, the easy answer to the last question is no. Not everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. But Hannes listed 3 people who are enemies of entrepreneurship. I want to list 2 ideas that are enemies of entrepreneurship. The first, and I think this is a systemic problem with our friends on the left, is they operate on the assumption that the economy is a fixed pie. If someone like Bill Gates is very rich, by definition, other people have to be poor. And that's obviously not the case. Over time, the economy gets bigger, the economy gets richer, and both poor people, middle-class people, and rich people wind up with higher levels of income. But when you're dealing with someone on the left, they really believe this and trying to cure them of it, even if you sit them down in front of the data from the World Bank or any other institution, they really have a hard time grasping it and realizing how it operates. The other concept that's a challenge for supporting entrepreneurship and getting good policy is that people don't like what Schumpeter described as an inherent feature of capitalism, which is creative destruction. creative destruction is no fun if you're on the destruction side. If you're a typewriter repair person, or you own a typewriter factory, you work in a typewriter factory, and the personal computer comes about, you're destroyed. The entire community, as a matter of fact, may get destroyed because of the personal computer. Just like if you go back in history, the automobile wreaked havoc with the horse and buggy industry. The electric light bulb, I'm sure, did great damage to the candle making industry. People don't like uncertainty. And when you have people who don't like uncertainty, who vote, and politicians who don't like uncertainty, and of course they also have this zero-sum mentality that I just described, that creates a big challenge. So when thinking about how we can create the conditions to make entrepreneurship more likely and economic growth more likely, I have yet to figure out myself, and I don't know that anybody else has, how to successfully get people not to worry about creative destruction, and how not to think that the economy's a fixed sum pie. If we could somehow overcome those two obstacles, I think we'd be in much stronger shape.
Well, read Austrian economics, because this tells you that we have to look at it from the positive side, and there will always be a solution because we believe in innovation and new ideas. So you don't have to worry.
You understand that. I think people in this room probably understand that. But convincing politicians, convincing folks on the left, I mean, it really is amazing, this zero-sum mentality. I have literally opened up a laptop and shown numbers from Our World in Data website, run out of Oxford University. Great website filled with lots of data. You can see per capita GDP. You show them country after country. You show the data, and they still just, it's a visceral resistance to understanding that concept. And maybe it's just my limitations as someone who explains these issues, but until we get people to understand that it's possible for everyone to get richer at the same time, I think we're going to have a challenge. And I know I have failed in achieving that.
Oh, come on. Now, well, let's turn to Thomas, who is a local entrepreneur here. And you sure know how to create added value to your clients and to your environment. So how do you do that? And how do you feel, right now we have had another panel before where we saw the depression of Great Britain and England after Brexit, and still those hot topics, post Brexit, post COVID, post poly crisis. So give us a positive prospect, please.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for inviting me on, and thank you very much to our amazing hosts and team, and thank you for everyone that has come here today. So I run College Green Group, a PR lobbying firm. I founded it many years ago. I directly employ, I think it's about 45 people at the end of every month. I know if I include the children on the children, the family, the this, that, whatever else. And that's just a small part of what I do. In terms of where we are as a conservative movement, in terms of where we are for liberty, where we are in trying to find free markets, what does entrepreneurship mean? It's not regulation arbitrage. It's not that concept of being a bit fast and loose. It's about creating genuine value. It's about finding the gaps in the market and finding that opportunity out there, where society has said this is the way it's always done. I remember filling out my UCAS form that probably dates me quite a long time. One of the jobs it offered me was a sewing machine mechanic, and that was actually what I could have a lifetime's career, because it said not many people were entering this industry, and therefore it was right for someone to enter and make it successful. I'm not sure that's a necessary use of government resources in guiding people. Workforce planning is incredibly tough. At the best of times, most industries struggle with that concept. But what's really important is the government continually sees what companies do and then tries to do worse impressions of it. That's an appalling attitude. And workforce planning and the structure of what we need to do, it's okay to fail. I am so privileged with the mentors and the guides that I have had in my life that say, Tom, just give it a go. I have competed against businesses that are 10 times larger than me. I competed against a dreadful monopoly that was spending £7 million supporting a the alternative vote mechanism, CLS, appalling industry monopoly system out there. And I created a balloting business to try and compete directly with that, to try and understand what's happening in that closed shop market, where we had government contracts directly subsidising union investments in union projects. We need to work out as a society, what is the country we want to create? How do we stop that petty corruption? How do we stop those activities of favours for the boys and make it okay for people to leap from that faithful paycheck at the end of the month, to be creative in that process? I think there's that great word out there, entrepreneurship. The idea that you don't need to go externally to make new value, that you can be a project captain within your own team, and that you can create and develop the people and the personalities to have that new business unit internally. And we don't give enough credence to those people that are entrepreneurs every day, that mother that's doing a better form of daycare in her local street, in the local corner, that baking shop, the large-scale investments we have. In the United Kingdom, we've had 17 unicorns. That's an appalling number. Only 17 unicorn firms, and that's second in Europe. How do we do better? And there's so much more we need to do.
So, well, we've seen the positive aspect, thank you, of entrepreneurship and of free enterprise. Now, what are the enemies? And that really destruct those free minds and those creative minds and those who actually take risks, because this is something that we always have to put on the table. People who are entrepreneurs take risks and they take responsibility every day, 24/7. So what are the biggest enemies? Who wants to start? Hannes, you're smiling.
No, I'm basically thinking about what the other people here in the panel have been saying, and how we can cope with, for example, this fear of uncertainty, yes. And one way, well, there are several ways of doing it. One is predictability, continuity, and a sense of community and belonging, social cohesion. I come from one of the Nordic countries. I come from Iceland. Iceland is characterized with a lot of social cohesion like the other Nordic countries. And I think this is one way of doing things. I will give you one example of how we can create entrepreneurship and the conditions for creative destruction without creating too much uncertainty. And that's when we had to close off our fishing grounds in Iceland. Because if we have open access, we have overutilization of the resource. And how did we do it? We did do it by giving fishing rights, exclusive fishing rights, to those who had already been fishing. We didn't auction them off. That would have created uncertainty. People would have had to leave, and they would have seen all their livelihood destroyed. Many of them would have had to leave the fisheries. Instead, we gave fishing rights to everybody who had been fishing on the basis of a catch history. And slowly over time, because the fishing rights were made transferable and permanent, those who were more efficient, they bought out those who were less efficient in a peaceful process. And then we saw a lot of entrepreneurship grow up, not only in the fisheries proper, but also in all kinds of services to the fisheries. So this, in my opinion, is a good example of what you can accomplish. But I would actually also raise here another question, which has vexed me. Nobody's given me a proper answer to it. Why is it that at the same time as there is much less need for any welfare benefits because of the prosperity of society, the welfare state has been growing?
Well, I think there is a Nobel laureate who has explained public choice theory. Could you elaborate on that, or do you want to, I mean, since it's US, Jim Buchanan was an American, maybe Dan, you want to jump on and explain that a little bit?
Well, for those who don't know, public choice theory, which James Buchanan got his Nobel Prize for, simply applied the economics of incentives to political behavior, which sounds like common sense. Yeah, of course politicians are interested in power, votes, money, campaign contributions, things like that. So when you explain public choice to ordinary people, they say, well, duh. But in the economics world, in academia, the analysis for decades had assumed politicians were angels who only wanted the betterment of society, and that was such an incredibly naive approach that Buchanan's insights, which again were nothing but common sense, won a Nobel Prize. And yes, that does explain a lot. Why does the welfare state get bigger? It's because politicians have an incentive to make it bigger. And actually, one of the questions on the first panel that Eamon said I should answer is, was the question of whether or not taxes automatically go up. Well, given the current structure of the welfare state that we're talking about, with aging populations, shrinking birth rates, yes, taxes and the burden of government spending will automatically go up if you maintain a tax and transfer welfare state. I would argue that countries that are moving toward funded systems with more private provision are doing it much better and will be much stronger in the long run. But I want to make one point to add on to what I said about creative destruction and what it means for society. I calculated recently, looking at data from our Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States, that on average over, I think it was 2017 to 2019, 3-year period before COVID, so a normal period, on average, 28 million jobs were lost every single year. But, and this is what I explained to people about dynamism and creative destruction, on average, 30 million jobs were created every year. So on net, 2 million more jobs were created every year than were destroyed. But within that net 2 million, 28 million lost, 30 million created. If you're one of the 28 million, that's painful. You don't know whether you're getting your next job, and maybe some of them didn't even get a next job. Maybe there were genuine tragedies and sadness with some of those people. But what's the alternative? And this is but even if you explain that to some of our friends on the left and try to say what system has ever done better, what system has ever created more jobs, has ever created more prosperity, they can't give you an answer, but they still look at those 28 million, they ignore the 30 million, and they focus on the genuine sad stories that exist within those 28 million. These are challenges that we as believers in economic liberty and greater prosperity have, and they have vexed me for a long time because I have never come up with a way that I think is really successful, at least in a brief period of time, in not only educating someone on the numbers, but getting them to accept the implications of the numbers. That is a big challenge.
Since we also played spontaneously, Tom?
Fantastic. Well, no, let's start looking at, losses are localized, gains are globalized. That concept that I remember my steel mill going out of business, I remember all those different things, and yet steel being slightly cheaper, my railway prices being slightly cheaper because steel is now made somewhere else, isn't something I acknowledge, something that I can't tangibilize. People dramatically see losses 5-10 times as much as a gain. And we have this huge inherent loss aversion. In terms of your question, it's a very, very aggressively difficult question. What's holding entrepreneurship back? And ultimately, I'd love to blame it's the people that label us as people that do regulation arbitrage, those people that steal from our future, those people that do all sorts of atrocities out there. But it's the entrepreneur themselves. It's the entrepreneur deciding it's easier to take that extra night's sleep and to hold themselves back. A 1% gain every day is something people idolize. That concept of just doing that a little bit better. That extra run, that extra flight of stairs, that one more piece of fruit and veg, that one more piece of growth, whatever it may be. If every small business in the United Kingdom grew 1% next year, I think that's about 20 billion. I think that's a pretty decent sized number. But all I'm asking is every business to grow 1% more. And there's some pretty serious stats when you look at that multiplier, the number of people and number of industries out there. The capital markets, what the government has recently done with Silicon Valley Bank and the idea that we had a ring-fenced bank in the United Kingdom that is entirely sovereign, has been entirely sovereign. I do question how one large bank has got such a valuable asset so cheaply. But it is really, really important that we look after and we protect those industries. Many of you have heard of SEIS, the investment schemes that we have. The idea that I can invest in companies with my post-tax income, and if all goes wrong, I get it back. That's absolutely fabulous. These are some really, really amazing schemes. We've had dreadful problems with the R&D tax credit scheme in this country. We've had people that had theft from you and I as taxpayers when they wrote on their form they were doing innovation in their restaurant by working out if avocado looked good on the menu. That is not a sensible use of your and my hard-earned taxpayers' money.
Well, since you mentioned, we were looking into the British Growth Fund from the
Yes.
Austrian Central Bank. And well, this was a wonderful example for us post-COVID to gear entrepreneurship and to get venture capital into the system, because we in Austria definitely lack venture capital. Our capital market, unfortunately, is not as well built as the London at least was.
Yeah.
And thanks to Lady Thatcher, I mean, without her, I think the city of London wouldn't be what it is today,
Yes.
and the world would not look at London and the financial market here. But still, there needs to be something that triggers.
The building great fund and some of those activities of export funded credit. There isn't that next zeitgeist. We've tried with battery technology. We've tried creating innovation hubs. We're trying with Oxford. We're trying with Cambridge. There is a huge benefit of localized knowledge and technological focus in different areas. We're trying on that, but we haven't kick-started to be great. There aren't enough second cities in the United Kingdom. London is huge. London is absolutely fabulous and has that circle of innovation, and the second cities across the United Kingdom are really suffering because they are not having those investors. We tried with directly invested mayors. We tried giving them funding. We tried giving them powers. But there's not enough refocusing of the powers and levers of central government in the regions, and then the investments and the banks. Goldman Sachs has all sorts of different regional offices. Everyone is out there going, what's going to happen next? But ultimately, they're all coming to London, and then they're leaving London for the bigger subsidized money in America. And that's a huge problem for us.
So the de-investment rack,
Yes.
actually, that you're, and the brain drain that we were talking about in the first panel. Is there anything we should add here, or should we open the questions?
I would like to make a comment relating to also what was discussed in the first session, because I'm not as much of a pessimist as some people are, and I'll just give you an example why. I have been engaged for the last year or so in writing a book about Nordic classical liberalism, where I argue that the Nordic countries are successful despite social democracy, but not because of social democracy. And if you look at Sweden, for example, in the 19th century, the classical liberals, Gripenstedt and others, who were disciples of Bastiat, they were in power in Sweden, and they basically liberalized the economy very extensively. And that was the time when all these large Swedish companies, they were founded in late 19th century and early 20th century. And then the Social Democrats, they came to power in the 30s and they reaped the fruits of it. However, they then went too far in the 1980s. They basically landed on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, so that the tax revenue started to be diminished with the increased tax rate. But because Sweden is a democratic society with a lot of discussion and open-mindedness and so on, what they did was to sit down and say, we are really on the wrong track. And they have been retracing from that period and opening up possibilities for entrepreneurship, even if there is still, the taxes are still too high there. So that's one example of a country that returned from the wrong thing. Other examples would be obvious to a lot of people here. One is New Zealand under a Labour government in 1984, and the best known example would of course be Mrs. Thatcher here in the United Kingdom. But I can't resist telling you a little story, if I may,
Sure.
about Mrs. Thatcher. Um, my intellectual mentor was Friedrich von Hayek. And in 1985, we had a dinner party with him here in London. We had founded the Higher Society at Oxford University. And he was in a very good mood. And he explained to us how Mrs. Thatcher had disarmed him. He said, well, actually, soon after she had formed her first government in May 1979, she learned that I was in London, and she invited me to lunch at 10 Downing Street. And she greeted me at the door, and she said to me, Professor Hayek, I know precisely what you're going to say. You are going to say that I haven't done enough. And you're absolutely right. And Hayek said that after this, he had some difficulty in criticizing her. But the point of my story is that, you know, we are never doing enough. We just have to keep on fighting.
Well, and there are many other governments around the world that have made those changes, whether it was conservatives or even socialist governments that have implemented flat taxes. Or look at Germany, for example, Chancellor Schröder, who cut the welfare back then, and you know where Mrs. Merkel could kind of live on for the next 12 years in her chancellorship, and had the benefits of those reforms that were made. And any other examples that you could think of, or maybe the audience has some?
Well, there are many examples, but I'm going to do what Hannes did. He made a comment on the first panel. And I want to, Eamon said something about how he's sort of questioning his support for independent central banking. And I have the same sentiment, because one of the things that brought down Liz Truss, but also is an ongoing campaign to undermine Brexit, is sort of this unholy alliance of the Bank of England, the IMF, the Financial Times, you name it, the OECD. All these people have this sort of establishment, sort of soft left mindset, and they were very, very clever. You know, when you had that hiccup in your financial markets with some of the hedged pension funds and stuff like that, completely due to the Bank of England radically expanding its balance sheet in 2020, 2021. It then, just like we're having some of the fallout from that in the US with Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank and stuff like that, you have some of the fallout here in the UK. And the Financial Times and the IMF, they were masterfully clever, grossly dishonest, but masterfully clever in saying, oh, this is the financial market reacting against the idea that Liz Truss is going to, bring the top rate down from 45 to 40 and stuff like that. Utter nonsense, but it gets repeated. And I think the other side, I just as a matter of political cleverness, I have to give them credit because they do a masterful job at it. And our side, unfortunately, is, I don't know, maybe our side just dumb.
I don't think they are dumb, but unfortunately, obviously, too many of us do not tweet and retweet nonsense that, and we know, and we are probably, hopefully, all as humble as Hayek was when he explained the pretense of knowledge in society and the certain arrogance of people who believe they know everything. And we have to take a step back and say, no, we do not. There are external shocks, there are risks that we cannot price in, and there are, as we are all human beings, we make mistakes, and there are many mistakes that especially we have on the financial side and the monetary side, we should not make, and we have discussed it. And since you mentioned that, I mean, ever since the GFC, we knew that money printing and expanding the balance sheet of central banks on both sides of the Atlantic does not help. As a matter of fact, the balance sheets have been extended to an extent that was not healthy, that was totally unhealthy. And then after all, if interest is below zero, and the interest rates were, for more than a decade, 15 years in a row, below zero in the Eurozone, and this is not healthy either. So all those things need to be normalized again, and we need to go back to sound money. but it takes time. And of course, while you do that, there are problems that are being created, and you cannot bail out everybody. I think
They'll
that's,
try.
they try, but you can't do it. I mean, there's a reason why those laws and regulations were in place. You just can't overthrow them.
But why don't we make sure we get some questions?
Yes. Any questions? Yes, please.
Well, I'm a little bit surprised that no one has blamed directly government for what's stopping entrepreneurship in itself. Even, yes, I agree. He gave me like the look, like, of course I agree. But in the panel, there was.
I think this is a given in this round here. But maybe you want to comment.
Or maybe another question would be, we Austrian historians, we analyze the world according to macroeconomics and innovation theories, but within the new young entrepreneur, within the new generations, there's a lot of cultural Marxism, the young wokeism, cancel culture. So I wonder if you guys could give an explanation of wokeism, cancel culture, people that are 18, 24, that they might not even understand, and they equate capitalism with racial supremacy and theories that are not very connected.
We have that issue big time in the U.S. with what's called the 1619 Project, and and that's the idea that the American Revolution was fought over slavery, that we wanted to preserve slavery. So even though the UK didn't get rid of slavery till 1833, somehow American colonists knew that it was going to happen, and so we had a revolution against British rule solely to preserve slavery. Even left-wing historians mock it and view it as utter nonsense, but it's crept into the American educational system because our teacher unions are probably the most pernicious political force in the country. They're very left-wing. But in the corporate world, the whole DEI industry has become massive. And of course, that's also in the school system as well. And the basic message is that if you're white, you're automatically bad. If you're a minority, you're automatically a victim. That's it's not good to tell whites they're automatically bad, but it's even worse to tell minorities they're automatically victims, because it, in effect, undermines their self-esteem and their incentives to achieve and whatnot. So it's a major problem, this whole cultural wokeness in the U.S. It's not my area, so I have no idea how to fix it. But we're seeing it play out in terms of politics. Just today, major fights between Governor DeSantis of Florida and the Disney company. And it's fascinating to watch, because from a libertarian perspective, I like the idea of Disney having private governance. I like the idea of Disney having the right to make its own decisions, even if I might not agree with them. I don't like the idea of a politician telling a private company what to say. But a lot of people on the right are saying, because corporations have been so captured by this cultural Marxism, wokeism, whatever you call it, it's really blurring a lot of the traditional lines of how people line up.
Tom, if I interpret you right, you mentioned that if every entrepreneur in Great Britain did 1% better next year and would not lean back and probably not rely on government handouts that we have seen across Europe with COVID, for example, or to help enterprises survive COVID, wouldn't that be the better solution? Get rid of those subsidies.
I think there's a huge set of problems out there. There's enough blame that we can all share a little bit. And it's really, really important. We need to understand that there's a lot that has gone wrong. But ultimately, it's about taking that personal responsibility for your business, that personal responsibility. We must kind of believe in that individual right to be successful and that individual right to be a bit lazy. And we must allow people to be lazy, and we must allow people to take those bigger risks and those more exciting risks.
Sorry, once you are lazy, then you can't expect to have a full coffers and drive whatever cars, fancy cars.
Yeah, you need to pick the lifestyle and the compromises you want to take in life. And you get asked by people, what, I'm 17, 18, 19, 20, what job do I want to do? My response here is, what lifestyle do you want to have? Because that is the Faustian pact. That is the pact you need to make with society at large to say, if you want to do these things, if you want to stay and have your personal lifestyle and not to conform to the whims and wishes of desire of society, you can do that, but you're not going to be as financially successful most of the time unless you're in pop music, unless you're one of the celebrities, and that you can be as whatever you want to be, but blaming that government is as bad as blaming that corporation. And it's pretty poor news. It's really bad that we don't have self-discipline within the entrepreneurship community of those people that took those dodgy COVID loans, those people that took advantage of the generosity of us as taxpayers. And we need to be much better. Once upon a time, we had that concept of shame. Businessman to businessman sitting there round Lloyd's of London, round the old-fashioned banking sector, having lunches and dinners and getting involved with each other, and we knew the wrong ones. We knew the people that cheated society, and those are the people we shut down and we shut out of society. We have allowed those people to run riot with that precious sacred thing called capitalism, and we have allowed them to be a disservice to the other entrepreneurs out there that have filled out their tax returns honestly, that have worked within the operations of government.
Can I return to the question about the wokeness and identity politics, because I think it is a highly relevant question today. And I was reflecting about this now, and I would like to propose a theory, which I derive partly from the English philosopher Michael Oakeshott. Now, Michael Oakeshott would, and Hayek would actually agree, that possibly what I have called conservative liberalism, and I've written 2 volumes about it that are available online, called 24 Conservative Liberal Thinkers, that conservative liberalism, a combination of conservative insights and classical liberal principles, is the self-consciousness of Western civilization. It is really Western civilization when it becomes conscious of it as individuality, individuals who have acquired the will and the ability to make choices. So that's what both Hayek and Oakeshott would say. But then Oakeshott goes on and says that the socialists are people who deny this self-consciousness, who say this is not our self. We have to be members of a collective of one kind or another. And in the past, the collective was the class, the Marxist class. And Marxism was a substitute religion. People who believed that God was dead, they transposed all the conceptual apparatus onto Marxism and started to believe that you could build paradise on earth and so on. We all know that. Now, then Marxism died. Marxism is dead. And what has replaced Marxism is other kinds of identities, like very radical feminism, where the collective is women, or very radical environmentalism, where the collective is nature, or being a part of nature, and so on. Now, I hasten to add that I am myself obviously in favor of equality of the sexes, and I am in favor of a pure environment. Although I believe that equality before the law and private property rights to natural resources are the right responses to the problems that people bring up. But my point is this, that perhaps wokeism, and this is something that I haven't thought of until now, perhaps wokeism is sort of substitute Marxism. Marxism after Marxism died.
Please, 1, 2, 3.
I can comment on a lot of things you've said today, but I think Thomas has really hit something there, that there is no shame, and I think that the government in a way and society is to blame for what's happened because we started saving people. It sounds really cruel, but from back in the 80s when governments all around the world were giving companies subsidies so that they wouldn't move the jobs out of the country and things like that. They were so terrified of unemployment. That started the rot, and companies that used to keep money set aside in reserves for a rainy day or whatever, or were conscious of new changes in technology and moving with those times, they suddenly realized they didn't have to do that. They just had to get in good with government, and they could get someone to stop change and stop things happening. But at the same time, I would say life is much better in the real world than a lot of academics think, and a lot of people in Westminster think. There is a very thriving entrepreneurial culture in the UK, not only down in the City of London, where we've got a lot of fintech things happening, but even in the service economy. I live in an area that Thomas knows well as well, and I didn't know 20 years ago that I needed to be within 10 yards of a nail bar. I didn't realize that I needed to have people who would deliver me flowers once a week on a bicycle. I didn't know that I needed a little shop, which you can't even go into, but there are kids on bicycles outside who at 2 o'clock in the morning I can ring and they'll deliver milk to me. These are services I didn't even imagine 30 years ago. Now I'm surrounded by them. I live in a very affluent area of London, I must admit. But even I am sitting there with my accountant's head on going, how does this make money? I mean, that's ridiculous. Who orders milk at 3 in the morning delivered by a guy on a bicycle? Well, people obviously do, because these guys haven't gone out of business. They're still there. But I will also say this in defense of the woke. That's a big industry. Don't knock the woke. They're not doing this for nothing. All of those guys have seen that this is a way of making money. Half of them are getting money out of various governments. Most of them are bleeding the good-natured people of Britain dry by telling them about the number of email ads I get on my phone when I'm listening to a YouTube video telling me about, starving polar bears, or for 80 cents I can feed a child, or, and you're sitting there going, yeah, well, I'm a free trade economist, let's trade with them and we'll feed them all. But, you get this stuff and people are giving money. So woke is big industry. The good news is Budweiser might have suddenly burst the bubble, which is fantastic, and I'm so pleased about that. But I am one of the few people who pull up the Financial Times when they say something really hideously. But it's amazing how I think our side, I'm not sure they're stupid, I think they're scared. I think people are terribly nervous about getting a Twitter pile-on. Mm-hmm. And I think that they are saying these lies so often, everyone believes them. And, the 4% drop in GDP because of Brexit, it's like, that isn't even what the OBR said, but that's been repeated and repeated and repeated. And very few people will stand up and say, no, that's not right. And it becomes truth. And then no one wants to say, that's not right. So I've enjoyed this. What I was going to say, I started my first job many, many years ago was at IBM. And because I was the new kid out of the economics degree, econometrics, I was given typewriters. So IBM's biggest seller at the moment at that time was typewriters, and they gave that to me. And they did sell personal computers, but they had the sort of capacity of a watch today, maybe even a Fitbit. But we also had a typing pool. And when I wrote a report and stuff, I had to take it down to the typing pool, and it was the head typist in the typing pool showed me this amazing thing they had called a word processor. And how it could remember like a whole line, and that was amazing. So she didn't have to keep retyping things when we made a correction. It could remember a line, and so it's made her life so much easier. And she explained all this to me. Now she was really smart. What she hadn't worked out, and because of my job I knew what was coming, her job was going. That this was going to be replaced by something that could remember a whole page and then a whole document, and lo and behold, everyone in my group would learn how to type, and we didn't need to take documents down to the typing pool with writing all over them and get someone to type them up. But I've never seen troops of unemployed ex-typists sitting under the arches, down by the river, with a cup saying, ex-typists, give me money, They all found other jobs. And yet this was a huge part of employment when I started work. So I think smart companies can see things are changing and they move with the times. And IBM didn't say, hey, we make a lot of money selling typewriters, so we're going to go to the government and insist that they do not allow word processors to become made. They actually developed their own word processor.
Well, don't forget Bastiat's famous satirical essay on, what was it, the boycott the sun or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's putting candle makers.
The
out of
candle
work.
makers.
Yeah.
Well, definitely.
Thank you. There were 1, 2, 3. Gentleman here. You.
So I think when we talk about entrepreneurship, it's always like the small companies, the new industries, the innovation, what comes to people's mind. But a lot of entrepreneurship is also like the hostile takeovers, breaking up of companies, restructuring companies, private equity buyouts. And it seems in most people's mind, the second part is much more unfavorable than the new company, the new innovation. But the old companies and the established industries are a bigger part of the economy. So how do you see, like, how important is like creating an environment to have new companies flourish and new innovations flourish? And how important do you think is the second part of entrepreneurship, which is the restructuring of current companies, like hostile takeovers, because this is, in most cases, I think, less popular, and but also a big part of entrepreneurship.
I'll just say something real fast. Obviously, I'm in favor of hostile takeovers. This is part of the way of disciplining management that gets lazy and fat. The only caveat, and unfortunately it's a big caveat nowadays, is when central banks are dumping money into the system, and there's so much cheap capital out there, you have a lot of artificial mergers and acquisitions and I want to make sure that it's genuine market forces driving takeovers and things like that. I don't want it to be simply a bunch of people at Goldman Sachs having so much free money sitting on the table that they figure out something else to generate fees with.
May I add one thing about this, because I think this is a crucial point actually for capitalism. And Ronald Coase pointed out that in The Nature of the Firm in 1937, it was a seminal article, that it is not a given how we structure companies, how capital is composed, how we merge or acquire and transfer capital, and what is the optimal size of companies. And this is precisely one role that the entrepreneurs they play in a free economy. They approach the optimal size of companies by seeing what is most economic, whether we should have 2 or 3 companies doing the same, or merge them, or acquire something else. So I think this is essential. And when I was teaching political economy, I stressed this part of the whole entrepreneurial function, to decide upon the composition and the size of capital.
Last 2 questions. Yeah, the 2.
Sorry, it's not much of a question, it's more of a collection of facts. One fact I learned while working at the FT when Thomas Piketty's book came out. Thomas Piketty's thesis relied a lot on statistics, financial Times data guy. Had a look at the statistics and he did not like them. He went on panels, it's all played out in public, it's nothing confidential. He went on panels and decried the quality of the statistics. Shortly after that, the editor saw fit to award the book some sort of Financial Times award for being a very good book. That made me laugh. Hopefully it served that purpose here as well. Another thing going on, Vivek Ramaswamy, a presidential candidate in the US, is going around mentioning that ESG, environmental social governance criteria, is being put into investment houses such that investment houses have to make investments that promote woke. Is he on to something?
This is probably something that you could answer. And then you can. Yeah.
There's a lot of analysis, and I don't think we know the answer yet, that a lot of the ESG stuff is just empty virtue signaling. The Business Roundtable famously changed their statement about the purpose of a company no longer being exclusively to maximize profits for a shareholder, consistent with what Friedman said about ethical behavior. And they made it much more broader, including a lot of the ESG stuff. But then somebody did an analysis through the COVID period, and it turns out these Business Roundtable companies were more likely to lay off employees and do all the things that they piously claimed in their letter that they were no longer all about. So I don't like ESG and the role that it's playing, but I suspect it's lip service by most people in the investment world. The one area where I do worry, though, is state pension funds. Pension funds representing state and local government bureaucrats. They're major players in financial markets, and I think they can drive companies, by virtue of their voting behavior, especially if they guilt BlackRock and a few others into going along with them. It could have a negative effect. But those decisions will simply create opportunities for other people to make profits, because these guys will be leaving money on the table by telling companies to do inefficient things.
Looking at ESG, in terms of your question, yes, the financial conduct market bill going through the House of Lords and House of Commons at the moment has provisions in it that says you need to do due regard to the ESG credentials. It is very clear that at the moment, if the amendments pass, then every banking industry needs to carefully